So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is April Wepler. I am the Engagement Coordinator at the Canadian Environmental Law Association, or CELA. And thank you for joining us for our webinar today. We are talking about a new toolkit that CELA is developing called Making the Links in Southwestern Ontario. And it's a toolkit for environmental action and part of our series of Making the Links toolkits. So I'll start off with a land acknowledgement. I'm calling in today from Guelph. I live on the banks of the Speed River, and I'm in the traditional lands of Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee peoples and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and Six Nations of the Grand Watershed. So Zoe, if you can advance to the next slide, please. So I'll start by telling you a little bit about the Canadian Environmental Law Association, or CELA. CELA is a public interest law clinic dedicated to environmental equity, justice, and health. Founded in 1970, CELA is one of the oldest advocates for environmental protection in the country. With funding from Legal Aid Ontario, CELA provides free legal services relating to environmental justice in Ontario, including representing qualifying low-income and vulnerable or disadvantaged communities in litigation. CELA also works on environmental legal education and law reform initiatives. We exist to ensure that low-income and disadvantaged people have access to environmental justice through the courts and tribunals. As long as communities face barriers accessing environmental justice, there will be a need for CELA's work. And Zoe, can you go to the next slide? And also just want to mention the Canadian Environmental Law Foundation, which is the charitable arm of CELA. And the foundation influences and uses environmental law and policy to safeguard equity, justice, and health. And we offer all of our webinars for free, but we like to mention that we're so grateful to the support of the donors to the foundation. It's critical to ensure that environmental law continues to evolve and the gains of the last 50 years are not forgotten. And the next slide, Zoe. We are pleased today to be co-hosting our session with the Community Legal Clinic for Brant, Haldeman, and Norfolk, and you'll learn more about them in just a moment when I pass the microphone to Carrie Sinkowski. Also on the line today from CELA are Teresa McClenahan, who's our Executive Director, Jacqueline Wilson, who is Counsel, Kirti Vyas, who's our law student from Osgoode Law School, and Zoe St. Pierre, who is CELA's current articling student. A quick bit of housekeeping. We are hosting today on Zoom webinar, so you'll note that your microphones and your cameras are automatically turned off. I would encourage you to introduce yourself, share a land acknowledgement if you'd like, tell us what organization you work with in the chat box. So you should have access to the chat. And then you're welcome to share your questions either in the chat box or using the Q&A feature, whichever you prefer. We're fine taking questions at any time in either of those ways. We are recording today's session. The webinar will be recorded, and we'll be posting the recording on our website after the session. We will also share it out to all of you via email, so you'll get it directly via email. We're not going to record the Q&A portion. We're just going to record the presentation portion of the webinar today. So the agenda is up on the screen here. You can see we're starting out with some introductions, and then I'll pass it over to Carrie. Then we'll hear from Kirti Vyas, who's going to talk about the toolkit, followed by Jackie Wilson talking about our climate change and vulnerable communities resources. And then we'll shift into some Q&A and discussion time towards the end. So just for a bit of context on the toolkit before I pass it over to Carrie. So this is the newest toolkit in the series of Making the Links toolkits that CELA has, and I'll put a link to the toolkit website in the chat box in just a moment. So we're sort of in the final stages of developing this toolkit. We are wanting to gather some feedback today through the discussion about issues that are relevant to you and your communities. We'll use that feedback to put the final touches on that report, and then it will go up on our website, and we'll also be emailing it out to everyone. So you'll probably get 2 emails from me, one with the recording, and then subsequent to that, the toolkit itself. We're also listening carefully today to the discussion because we're interested in doing some in-person sessions in some of your communities in the spring and summer months. So we'll have some questions for you during the discussion period so that we can come and talk to you more about the issues that are relevant to you and your communities. So with that, I am going to pass the microphone over to Carrie to tell us a bit about her legal clinic.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, April. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning, and it's nice to see some familiar names in the chat or on the attendee list. Sorry, my internet keeps going out, so I apologize if it keeps glitching out.
No, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I'm the community developer for the Community Legal Clinic, and we're based in Brantford, but we cover a large area, which is Brantford, Brant County, Six Nations of the Grand River, Mississaugas of the Credit, Haldeman County, and Norfolk County. So our catchment area is largely rural, and it's extremely spaced out, and it's very heavy in agriculture. So looking at climate change, this was an issue that we were really we're concerned about as a clinic, and how it impacts local agriculture in terms of local citizens as well. And so we were excited to partner with CELA on the on sharing this information today. So our clinic, as I said, is based in Brantford, but we do service that large area virtually, as well as we can meet with people out in the community. We've been around since the late 80s, and we practice primarily in housing law. So that's the main thing that we're seeing right now, is folks experiencing eviction, rent evictions, and a lot of refusal to repair places. And then the other area that we practice quite a bit in is income security. So looking at ODSP appeals. And then we also have an employment lawyer and a sexual harassment in the workplace lawyer. And an area of law that we're seeing a bit more of recently is consumer law. So like utility bills, contracts that you have with cell phone companies, payday loan places. So those are the areas that we practice in. And for other areas that we're not practicing in, that people are experiencing issues with, we do offer referrals to other resources. We're also in the community offering public legal education sessions on various issues. We do a lot of them on power of attorney and tenant rights and responsibilities, and we can do those for any group or any agency or organization that is looking to learn more about those legal issues. And then my program, which is the community development program, is focused on setting up those education sessions. But I also run workshops on self-advocacy and communication, and I run those with the libraries and other local organizations. And then I engage in community event planning, so conference planning. And for anyone who lives in Norfolk County, I organize a soccer tournament every August for migrant farm workers. It's always the second Sunday of August. It's a pretty good day of soccer. It's a full day, it's just a one-day tournament, but this year we're going to have a mini tournament in June as a lead up to it. So that's sort of my job, is kind of all over the place, and the lawyers are very focused in the 5 areas of law that I shared at the beginning. So I thank you all for coming today, and I will turn it back to April, I think. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carrie. That's great. All right, and at this time, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Kirti to give us her presentation about the toolkit.
Awesome, thank you, April. Everyone can hear me fine, I'm guessing? Yeah. Yes, okay.
Yes, sorry, I didn't unmute. Yes, we can hear you.
All right. So hi, everyone. My name is Kirti Vyas, and I'm a JD candidate at Osgoode Hall Law School. Now, over the past 7 months, I've worked at CELA as a placement student through the school's Environmental Justice and Sustainability Clinic. And today, I'm pleased to present to you CELA's latest Making the Links Toolkit, the Toolkit for Environmental Action in Southwest Ontario. Now, this toolkit contains information on how you can use the law to prevent environmental harm to you, your community, and your regions. And it includes useful tips on public engagement and introduction to available legal tools, as well as additional information that's going to help you better understand the environmental law landscape in Southwest Ontario. Now, before we begin, it's important that we start with an understanding of some of the key terms that are essential to inform environmental issues generally throughout Canada. So for the next slide, let's start with environmental health. What is it? Environmental health is a branch of public health that's concerned with monitoring or mitigating factors in the environment affecting human health and disease. It focuses on the interrelationships between people and their environments and addresses all the physical, the chemical, biological factors that are external to a person, as well as all the related factors that might impact their behaviors. Some issues that might impact environmental health include access to clean water, access to healthy foods, as well as exposures to toxins and carcinogens. Now, federal, provincial, and municipal governments, including some Indigenous governments, play a key role in regulating environmental health, particularly through their environmental law and policy decision-making powers. Now, our next term that we're going to be looking at is environmental racism. This refers to the disproportionate proximity and exposure of Indigenous and racialized communities to polluting industries, dangerous projects, and other environmental hazards. Environmental racism tends to occur when environmental policies and practices, either intentionally or unintentionally, result in disproportionate negative impacts on certain communities, including higher rates of cancer, reproductive diseases, birth defects, and other types of health issues that might impact them as well too specifically. And if you look on this next slide as well too, the term itself, environmental racism, was first coined by Benjamin Chavez back in the 1960s, I believe. I hope that number is correct. And he defined this term in 3 to 5 different kinds of having 3 to 5 different kinds of environmental racism, depending on how you define the term. So as you can see here on the screen, we kind of like put them into 3 different forms of environmental racism, which can include the lack of political power of racialized communities to resist the intentional sightings of industrial polluters in their communities, implementing policies allowing life-threatening poisons to be in a community, as well as the historical exclusion of racialized communities from environmental decision-making and policymaking. So subsequently, if environmental racism is framed as the problem we wish to solve, then environmental justice would be the solution. So environmental justice is a principle that promotes environmental benefits and burdens being equitably distributed among all persons, rather than allowing the majority of these adverse impacts to be unfairly imposed upon poor people, visible minorities, or other marginalized communities. Environmental justice requires the elimination of environmental racism and class-based discrimination, as well as promoting Indigenous self-determination. Our next term would be exploring what the right to know is. Now, the right to know is a principle that's based upon a basic human entitlement to information that's directly impacting the health and bodily integrity of the person. A public right to know includes having access to databases which require the identity of chemicals to be disclosed, as well as their hazardous properties and their potential health impacts. Now, this concept ties closely in with the employment law concept of the worker's right to know, which involves an employee's right to know about the hazards of work that directly impact their health and bodily integrity as well there too. The next term that we're going to be looking at as well, is what free, prior, and informed consent is, also known as FPIC. Now, the term informed consent draws upon 2 meanings in both the legal and the medical context. The concept of free and prior informed consent is defined along similar lines. However, specifically, FPIC is a legal concept. It incorporates the inherent right of all Indigenous peoples worldwide, and it is detailed under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, also referred to as UNDRIP for the short form as well too. So what does free, prior, and informed consent entail? Well, free means that consent is given voluntarily without coercion or manipulation. Prior means that consent is sought sufficiently in advance of the commencement of any proposed environmental activities that might require Indigenous consultation. Informed means that information is provided in a timely manner and information is adequate to this community prior to seeking the consent, and understanding that the consent process itself is an ongoing matter. And finally, consent is the official final decision, and it's made by these right holders according to their particular decision-making processes and working with the community to come to a decision on whether or not to consent. Now, as per 2021, the FPIC, the Free, Prior, and Informed Consent of Indigenous Communities, is mandated as per the adoption of the UNDRIP Act by the federal government. This recognizes and upholds Indigenous rights in Canada and ensures their meaningful participation in decisions that impact them, their communities, as well as their territories. And while often spoken about in the Indigenous context, free, prior, and informed consent also applies to racialized communities, where there are projects that are proposed that might treat their communities as dumping grounds for contaminants and other environmental hazards. So now that we have an understanding of some of these key terms, we can move on to some Southwestern Ontario specific case studies of environmental issues that are occurring within the region. So our first case study would be Sarnia, also deemed as the sacrifice zone. So Canada has a number of international obligations that have created a duty for us to prevent exposures to toxic and other hazardous substances. And this duty needs to be upheld by the state, businesses, and local leaders. In 2019 specifically, the United Nations Special Reporter, Basket Tinkak, visited Canada, I hope I said his name properly, making stops in several municipalities, rural and Indigenous communities across Ontario. His goal for this report specifically was to monitor and assess the steps that were being taken by the Canadian government to protect human rights that were being implicated by the management of hazardous substances and waste. And during his visit to Southwestern Ontario, the Southwest Ontario region specifically, the reporter visited Amjinwang First Nation, which he found to be in a deeply unsettling crisis. Now, this First Nation has been subject to a torrent of industry polluters invading their lands to set up over 60 industrial facilities since the 1940s. The community has been surrounded by factories, manufacturing plants, and other facilities that have high pollutant emissions and contaminants that seep into the river and nearby environment, impacting the health of residents in the vicinity. In fact, it's considered to be one of the most polluted areas in all of Canada and is also informally referred to as Chemical Valley. So next slide. So the health impacts of being a hubspot for industrial facilities are real and concerning. And in fact, a 2019 study of acute myeloid leukemia incident rates in Canada, so AML is a type of blood cancer that you can find. They found correlations between AML rates and cities that had higher rates of industrialization. Specifically, when we looked at Sarnia, there were 106.81 deaths per 1 million people. This death rate is more than 3 times the Canadian national average. And specifically, we found that the postal code FSA N7V has the most significant rate of deaths per million. Now, the constant risk of impending disasters and health impacts from chronic exposures to poisonous substances have led to a variety of physiological as well as mental stresses to the community members. The special reporter found that the regulations that are currently in place do not protect the community's health and should be a primary concern to address. So how are some ways that Canada as well as Ontario can address them? Well, they can investigate and document these health impacts to their community members. They can conduct proper monitoring of harmful substances. They can enforce the existing standards that are set up to protect this community. And they can also conduct cumulative risk assessments as well too. So this leads us then to our second case study, which involves nuclear planning and the Great Lakes region. Now, emergency planning involving nuclear power plant operations has been an issue of concern over the past many years across Southwest Ontario. Residents in the Southwest live close to around 20 nuclear reactors in the Great Lakes region and other US-based reactors south of the border. Residents, particularly in the Windsor and Essex County regions, live within 100 kilometers of the Michigan Fermi plant and the Ohio Davis-Besse nuclear plant, making them more susceptible to serious health risks in the cases of accidents. Now, a variety of citizen groups have actually been calling on the province to distribute potassium iodide, or also known as Ki pills, for those who live in this region, which would protect them from thyroid cancer in the event of a nuclear accident, given that these communities have such a close proximity to nuclear plants. Next slide. So Ontario's Nuclear Emergency Response Plan mandates that municipalities need to address nuclear emergencies in their municipal emergency plans in order to protect their citizens from the hazard or to act in their capacity as a host municipality, which means, so acting as a host municipality means being able to take in citizens from the designated municipality that might be subject to these hazards. Now, particularly, the city of Windsor and the town of Essex have been designated as host municipalities in the event of any nuclear disasters that might occur at the Fermi 2 plant in the town of Amherstburg, Michigan. In the event of nuclear disasters, CELA has advocated for a variety of reforms for an expansion of emergency preparedness plans, which involves expanding emergency preparedness zones, meeting international best practices for emergency responses, and establishing new measures that would protect sources of drinking water in the event of any accident. And as you can just see on this next slide here, this is just a little picture of the provincial website that designates which municipalities would be considered as designated host municipalities. And once you get the toolkit itself too, you'll have like a link towards it where you can find this as well. So next up, you might be asking at this point, what can I do? There are all these environmental issues you get a glimpse of some of the environmental issues that are occurring in the Southwest region. So what are some of the opportunities that we have for engagement for public action? Well, public participation is a crucial part of the environmental law and decision-making process. Participating in environmental decisions and advocacy is a helpful way that would enact positive change in your community. And it often takes the form of public comment periods and consultations. And it's essential that you take the chance to exercise these rights whenever that you can get the chance. So let's begin with our first tool, which is the Environmental Registry of Ontario. So this is also informally called the ERO. So the Environmental Bill of Rights is what gives Ontario residents the right to have a say and publicly participate in environmental decision-making. The ERO is the means through which this participation can occur. The ERO has all postings regarding permits, approvals, and open consultation periods that are related to environmental projects within the province. This is an important website that we highly recommend that you bookmark in order to stay up to date on developments and environmental impacts. Every posting contains information on the public comment periods that you can also engage with. And the Environmental Bill of Rights provides certain rights that you have when it comes to engaging in public participation, which includes rights to comment, rights to request investigations for violations of breaches, rights to request reviews of law and policies, and in some instances, rights to appeal or challenge decisions, as well as upholding the duty to consult for Indigenous communities as well, too. So we're going to quickly look at navigating the Environmental Registry of Ontario itself. So it begins with a notice. So once a proposal has been implemented, the ministry needs to post a notice on the registry that explains the effect, if any, that public participation would have on that specific proposal. So when it comes to using the registry and actually finding the notice, upon first visiting the site, you can view new postings in 3 different ways. And you can see these here, there's a picture on the screen at the bottom as well. So the first is using the general search tool. The second is to look at all the instruments, the permits, or the approvals posted in the last 7 days. Or you can also view all active consultations using the province's map function. So for the general search tool, this tool allows you to find notices by entering keywords, phrases, or the ERO number. And the tool itself is not case sensitive. And currently, from what we've last checked, as of February 2023, there are over 7,300 active matters that are undergoing public consultation on the ERO. So to filter your searches to Southwestern Ontario specifically, you can use several different variations of search terms. And these can further be filtered by date ranges, comment periods, notice types, notice stages, posted by specific ministries, such as the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, the act that's being considered, as well as the instrument type. And these searches can be done on the current list of active matters, but they can also be done on the ERO's archive of information on consultations that were on the province's older registry system as well, too. You can also search for proposals to comment on using the map if you're more of a visualizer like myself. So the map lets you search for instrument notices, permits, and approvals. And the location pin specifically reflects the approximate area where the environmental notice or the consultation activity is taking place. So you can then filter by the phase of which part of the public consultation is happening. So you can look for open notices, you can look for notices that are open for comment, or those with a decision already done. And generally speaking, we found that the most effective search term that you can use to find instrument notices are by using your general or your exact community location. So for example, if you search for all notices in Sarnia, Ontario, or you put in an exact address like 123 Sarnia Street, for instance, that would provide you with a better understanding of the instrument notices that are around you in your area. So you can also sign up for alerts, and you can register for an account on the website that allows you to receive email notifications for specific keywords when they appear on the registry. So for example, you can sign up to receive alerts about any new notice posted, which includes the words Southwest Ontario. You can also customize your notification preferences to receive news on consultations that you want to follow, or just general news from the ERO. So you just open up a notice, you scroll to the bottom of it, and you click follow this notice, and you can receive regular updates directly to your inbox and your email as well, too. Now, the next tool of interest that we're going to be looking at is the National Pollutant Release Inventory, the NPRI. So the NPRI is a publicly accessible database of pollutants that have been released on site to the environment, or transferred for disposal or recycling, and it's a database that's updated every year. It's published by a federal body, which is Environment Canada. Now, NPRI data is publicly available by going to the data search tool page, as you can see on this picture here, or by clicking pollution data and reports on their main page. And once you get to the data search tool page, you can do either basic searches that will help you find information on pollutant releases from particular reporting years, or you can do more advanced searches using an NPRI ID, a company's name, a postal code, or the name of a substance in an industry type, among many other different ways to do more of an advanced search on certain pollutants, as well as chemical industries as well too. And the website also has predefined queries that are being curated for you that show on-site release data broken down by media over the last 5 years too. So for example, if you search for Sarnia chemical plants on the NPRI, just doing a basic search, one of the plants that end up showing up includes Imperial Oil, as you can see on the screen here, where you can get a variety of different information. You can get their address, you can get their full information on pollutant releases by the facility, and you can use these tabs at the bottom. It's a bit difficult to see, but it says facility, pollutants, releases, disposals, and transfers, and other years. Thank you, Zoe. So the next tool is access to information requests. So sometimes the information you're looking for about an environmental or another matter is just not there. And that's why you need to make a request to access this information. Requests can be made to both provincial and federal institutions in Canada, and the process is similar for both. So any Canadian citizen, permanent resident, or person or corporation who resides in Canada can make a request. They can request for access to records of government institutions that are specifically subject to the Access to Information Act, and all requests need to be directed towards these specific institutions. And generally, you can tell if a government body is subject to these specific acts just by Googling and looking at their website as well too. In order to determine who you should address your request to, you can contact the relevant ministry and request the name of the Freedom of Information and the Privacy Coordinator, but also just by doing a simple Google search, you can also find an entire list categorically organized in alphabetical order of the names of privacy coordinators as well as emails. So you can submit your request by email or also by mail to the appropriate body. There's a minimum $5 application fee that's required for ATIP requests. And as of the past couple of years, the Government of Canada has actually also launched a new online ATIP request website that allows you to create, to manage, and track your ATIP requests. And you can send multiple requests in the system, you can receive replies online, and you can also get status updates on your requests as well too. So it makes it a bit of an easier chance to provide multiple access to information requests and receive information on them, hopefully on a timely manner. Now, the final tool we'll be looking at involves regulatory nuclear licensing planning. So the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, also known as the CNSC, reviews applications for nuclear licenses. There is room for public participation in these hearings by becoming an intervener. So interveners are members of the public or organizations that have an interest or an expertise in a particular matter who've requested the opportunity to present information on the subject of the proceeding, so such as the licensing of a new nuclear plant, for instance. Now, depending on the hearing, intervener submissions might be written, or they might be written as well as oral presentations. And when you submit an intervention, it's important to be focusing on why it's important that you're intervening, what are the key issues, and focusing on what the exact facts of this intervening submission would be. Now, during the licensing hearing, the public interveners are given about 10 minutes to address the commission. There's no opportunity to cross-examine or ask questions of the proponent or the CNSC staff. And you also cannot bring in experts that would question staff or statements that have been made by the proponent. You just go in, you make your 10-minute oral presentation or your written presentation, and that's it. But following that 10-minute oral presentation, should you choose to do so, the commissioners tend to ask follow-up questions, both to CNSC staff as well as the licensee, but there's not a chance for you to respond or weigh in on this. However, we really encourage you to not be afraid and make sure you speak up on these important matters, as we've learned from previous case studies that we've looked at today, that speaking up is very essential to exercising your public rights within Ontario. So finally, we'd like to end off this presentation with a list of maps and other resources that we've curated to you on one page that you can also click these links, I believe, as well too. So These are a number of different resources that are at your disposal throughout the province when you want to speak to various environmental issues or environmental tools here. So there's maps, there are the data search tools, there are guides to making requests for access to information, and there's also ways to prepare for different kinds of emergencies, including nuclear and others. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening to me today, and I'd like to pass it back to April.
Thank you so much, Kirti. That was a fantastic presentation. So much great information on all of those tools. I know those are all really complex, so going to be super helpful for people to have that overview, and nice job getting through a lot of really complicated tools in a short period of time. So as I said in the chat box, I'll just repeat in case anyone isn't looking at the chat, we are going to share that slide deck out with everyone as a PDF afterwards. So you'll have all the links that Kirti provided. And I'll just make a tiny note in case we have anyone from Amherstburg on the line today that we did make a slight typo on one of the slides and attributed that town to Michigan when in fact it's in Ontario. So apologies to anyone who's in that town. We'll make that correction before we circulate it. And with that, I will pass the microphone over to Jackie. And Zoe, if you want to get Jackie's slides up, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be speaking pretty briefly today about climate change and its impacts on vulnerable communities. We have a current law reform project at CELA focused on climate change and equity. And on the second slide of my presentation, we list some of the key impacts of climate change on health. You can look in more detail at the slide, but we mentioned things like flooding and all the associated impacts, such as extreme injury or death at the time of severe flooding, but also respiratory illness. For instance, if a basement apartment is flooded and is not properly remediated and there is mold. We also mentioned things like temperature extremes, which I'll speak about in a bit more detail, and increased air pollution, food insecurity, mental health impacts, an increase in vector-borne and waterborne diseases, and wildfires. The climate crisis is, of course, an ecological crisis, but it's also important to think about it in terms of policy and impacts on real people as an equity crisis and as a public health crisis as well. There's a very clear nexus between the worst impacts of the climate crisis and poverty and low-income people. The latest IPCC report that was published just a few days ago focused on the issues of equity. And in one of its statements, it said, prioritizing equity, climate justice, social justice, inclusion, and just transition processes can enable adaptation and ambitious mitigation actions and climate resilient development. Adaptation outcomes are enhanced by increased support to regions and people with the highest vulnerability to climatic hazards. Integrating climate adaptation into social protection programs improves resilience. The IPCC highlights 3 dimensions of climate change equity, which I find a useful way of thinking about the issues and a useful categorization. The first climate equity lens is intergenerational fairness, which means fairness between generations. The second is international, fairness between states. And the third is national, fairness between individuals within a state. I think there's a more common and broad understanding of the international aspects of climate equity, which are very important. But the focus of our work in our project currently is on the other two, on intergenerational equity and on fairness between peoples within our communities. The courts and the government have also recognized this connection between the climate crisis and low-income and vulnerable people. I've put up a few examples on this slide. One is the Supreme Court of Canada in the recent reference on carbon pricing, where they mention at paragraph 206 that irreversible harms to the environment, human health, and safety would be felt disproportionately by vulnerable communities and regions, with profound impacts on Indigenous peoples, the Canadian Arctic, and Canada's coastal regions. And I've mentioned a few others as well, the former Chief Justice of Canada, noting the inequitable impacts of climate change and a UN working paper. I point out these sources because it demonstrates that widespread and growing acknowledgement of the underlying equity issues exacerbated by the climate crisis. As I mentioned, CELA has a climate change in vulnerable communities project, and we've been writing short reports which seek to identify some of these inequitable impacts in our communities and propose some legal solutions or ways to try to assist with some of the impacts. The reports are available on our website at that link. One of the issues that we looked at in a report is flooding. As a result of climate change, the frequency and magnitude of floods in Canada is increasing. And floods are the most common natural disaster in Canada and are the costliest in terms of property damage. Mold proliferates in damp conditions and presents very serious risks to human health, especially to children, and especially to low-income children. There have been a lot of studies done at the close relationship between living in damp conditions, mold, and respiratory symptoms in children. And there's also that clear connection between low-income people and increased water damage and mold. One study found that vulnerable groups, including visible minorities, the elderly, lone parent households, Indigenous peoples, and low-income residents are at a higher risk for flooding in Canada. To give one example of how this can be dealt with, the City of Hamilton, in its recent climate change adaptation plan from 2022, identified that low-income tenants in basement apartments are particularly vulnerable to flooding. And the same will go for tenants in basement apartments throughout Southwestern Ontario. And they've proposed some solutions to try to assist with that identification of a particularly vulnerable group to a climate impact. What we're recommending in our toolkit is a few things. So one is flood mapping that will show vulnerability of low-income communities to provide information to try to get at that right to know concept. There's been recent federal funding announced on this issue to deal with flood mapping and to increase flood mapping across the country. And we'd like to make sure that it is in part directed at ensuring the equity piece of the mapping is included. We also recommend developing flood-specific emergency plans that are focused on equity and are very local. We also ask for grant programs to help low-income homeowners and to look at and assist with the owners of rental apartments with low-income tenants with the costs of prevention tools like backwater valves, green roofs, and sump pumps. There are some examples of bylaws which govern some of these flooding programs. One of interest that we mentioned in our toolkit is from London, Ontario, which enacted a basement flooding grant program bylaw to provide grants to certain owners of residential dwellings and a reserve fund that was established. It's called the Basement Flooding Grant Program bylaw. And finally, related to all of this, there should also be a focus on constructing new infrastructure to help manage flooding. I have mentioned green roofs, and there is a full toolkit on our website looking at green roofs as a good way to assist with dampening the effects of flooding in our communities. The next report I wanted to briefly mention looks at extreme heat. I think we all realize, unfortunately, that the temperature is rising in Canada, and various life-threatening conditions can occur when the body cannot maintain its core temperature of approximately 36.6 degrees. Findings in Quebec in 2018 after their heat wave and in British Columbia in 2021 after the heat dome were very similar and pointed to the fact that it's vulnerable communities that are by far most impacted by extreme heat, including seniors, infants and young children, individuals with chronic illnesses and morbidity challenges, and socially disadvantaged individuals. We have a recommendation, we have a few recommendations looking at how to adapt to extreme heat. One looks at urban tree cover. Urban heat islands have a significant impact on human health and can amplify heat waves. In Quebec, for instance, it was determined that the majority of people who died during the 2018 heat wave lived in urban heat islands. Planting urban trees is both a climate mitigation and adaptation strategy, and it helps to lower the temperatures in a community. The scientific literature has looked at and established that green infrastructure is much more prevalent in neighborhoods with higher socioeconomic status. For instance, there was a study in Toronto that found a measurable difference between neighborhoods which tracked socioeconomic status. What we recommend then is that every municipality, first of all, set a goal of 30 to 40% tree cover, but also do so through a tree equity approach, which would combine demographic data, socioeconomic data, and target low-income communities for additional tree cover. The next recommendation we make is to create a maximum temperature bylaw. It recognizes that indoor temperatures are a serious concern during heat waves. The Ontario Human Rights Commission made a recent statement on human rights, extreme heat waves, and air conditioning, which recognized that access to cooling during extreme heat waves is a human rights issue. That statement also recognized what I just mentioned, the disproportionate impact of extreme heat on groups protected by the Ontario Human Rights Code. And in that statement, they noted that it should be recognized, cooling, as a vital service under the Residential Tenancies Act. Our full report on a maximum heat bylaw is on our website as well. As I've mentioned, it's people who are most impacted by heat, for instance, elderly people, people with mobility challenges, people who are more socially isolated, are not well served by public cooling centers or even within a building cooling rooms. So what we need is a solution in people's homes in situ to help people be able to cope with heat. Unfortunately, I think there needs to be a shift in thinking. We intuitively understand in Canada why it's essential to have heat in winter, and with our worsening climate and longer and worse extreme heat events, it's become clear that maximum heat and active cooling is also essential. What we've put up here on the screen is a model bylaw, some of the language that we've proposed, that we hope that municipalities across the Southwest will look at and adopt. And what it does is define how the maximum temperature would be calculated. And that wording tracks how minimum heat is calculated under the Residential Tenancies Act, and provides requirements for landlords to provide active cooling so that there's a ability to keep the temperature under 26 degrees. The next report I wanted to highlight briefly is a report on outdoor and greenhouse agricultural workers in the region who are going to be faced with increasing extreme heat. And we note in our report, there's an amplified risk for migrant workers who are vulnerable for many other intersecting reasons. For instance, in a recent discussion that we had with a group of migrant workers, we learned that some employers have been preventing workers from bringing water with them into the field, which is an extremely dangerous practice, very much exacerbates the issues of extreme heat and must be stopped immediately. We've written a model heat illness prevention plan within our report, which would need to include some of the following issues. Employers must be better trained on their responsibilities to provide water, shade, sunscreen, cool down rests, and accelerated access to first aid. There should be a buddy system during extreme heat events. Workers need to be acclimatized to extreme heat. For a new worker, we have a full chart in our report, but for a new worker on the first day, they should only be working about 20% of the time, and then it gradually increases to the fifth day to 100%. Workers must be supplied with free water and sunscreen, and employers must provide shade. It may need to be artificial shade, as we appreciate what a workplace looks like, in an agricultural field. But those breaks need to be in shade, and there must be well-known and understood emergency response procedures in place. In our report as well, we have noted that some migrant workers are living in on-farm conditions, depending on the program through which they're brought to Canada. And we've heard from workers that those accommodations can be very hot and are not letting workers cool down at night. So we have also recommended mimicking the requirements of the maximum temperature bylaw that I just mentioned for these homes as well. They need to provide active, adequate cooling to maintain a maximum temperature of 26 degrees. Okay, I'm going to leave it there with a kind of quick overview of a few of the reports and turn it back to April.
Thanks, Jackie. Great, thank you, Zoe. Okay, so that concludes the formal presentation part of the webinar. We have a stay in touch slide here that has our website, a link for you to sign up for our bulletin, which is the primary way that CELA disseminates information, as well as all of our social media handles. I'm seeing some great questions in the chat already. So what we're going to do now is wrap up the formal part. So I'm going to say thank you to everyone for their presentations. Thank you to the attendees for being part of our session. I'll stop the recording in just a moment, but do stay on the line because we're going to have our Q&A happen in just a moment. So before I stop it, I'll just remind everyone, in case anyone kind of falls off over the next few minutes, that you'll receive the slide deck, the recording via email, and then we're going to take the feedback that we hear over the next 15 or 20 minutes, finish up the toolkit that we've been speaking to, that Kirti spoke to, and share that out by email as well. And that we're also really looking to kind of come into community and do some in-person sessions over the spring and summer. So we're also going to be listening for those issue areas that you want to learn more about, and locations that might be interested in having a session. So we'll talk more about that. All right, so I will say thank you very much, and we'll pause the recording here.